好，各位家长晚上好，欢迎来到爱儒教育分享 SAT 与文学关系的讲座。那么，爱儒教育呢是北美的在线教育公司，提供的是 K12课程。我们今天主讲的老师呢是 Dr. Lister，Steve Lister。Steve Lister 老师拥有30多年的教学经验，曾经在耶鲁的语言文学学院任教近10年。他不仅教 SAT，也长期的教授学生文学精读与写作，非常熟悉 SAT 阅读与文学分析之间的底层共通关系。那今天特别邀请 Dr. Steve Lister 老师给我们分享本次讲座。在此之前呢，我给大家看一下我们精读和写作课程体系，从低年龄段到高年龄段，根据孩子的阅读能力，我们分别设置了不同的读物里面的配套的练习以及课程安排。有需要的可以到时候加我微信来咨询。那么我们圣诞呢也会推出我们的圣诞精读课，以及 Dr. Lister 老师的 SAT 集训课。那接下去的话，我们就来听一下 Dr. Lister 老师给我们带来他的分享。Hi, Dr. Lister, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you so much.
在讲座的中间呢，我也会给大家进行一个翻译总结。
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone, and good evening. I'm here to talk to you about the SAT, and I have two presentations for you. First, we're going to talk about the SAT test. Hopefully, I can inform you as to all the new changes that have occurred since the change to the digital SAT about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And then we can talk about in a little more detail why the SAT is still very important, as you can see from the first slide, the trends in the scoring that have changed since a lot of the schools went score optional, and then the impact that has occurred upon our students when many of the schools have gone score optional. So I'm going to cover all these for you, and then we're going to transition over into some of the things that we hope to be able to do to remedy a lot of the difficulties students are facing with the new test. Most of us know that the SAT has been around for a very long time. It's been used to determine which students are going to be most reliably successful in college. Even though it's over the years suffered lots of controversies, it's still here and probably going into its 100th year, as you can see from this. It's one of the few ways that colleges still have of determining the relative merits of students coming in a kind of standard, arbitrary way, because they have no way of comparing actual scores from schools. That's a point to which we will return when we talk about the sudden GPS inflation and grade inflation that has occurred ever since COVID and many of the colleges going test optional. As you can see from this graph, this is a simulation of the score changes since COVID. You can see that pretty much the graph starts in 2021. Since 2021, the average score on the SAT, you want to sort of understand what that average score means. The average score on the SAT is stabilized by College Board. In other words, it's always the same average. No matter how well a particular cohort does on the SAT, they shift all of the scores so that it's always has the same average. So if a student takes the SAT on a day that the student doesn't have a particularly good day and everyone else does, well, that means that score that student is going to kind of suffer a penalty, because it's going to seem as though that test was much easier if everybody did well, and then they're going to scale the scores down. So that average doesn't really tell us much. What does tell us something, though, is what's happening to the scores that the colleges are accepting. You can see that the top 10% of submitted scores now are in the 1350 plus range. That's exceedingly high. I've been associated with this test and tutoring students for 30 years. And in the old days, if a student got an 1100 to 1200, that was perfectly good. They were getting scholarships to college for those kinds of scores, but now the 1350 is sort of a benchmark, and you've got to get not just that, but well above that to get into the highly competitive schools. As you can see, the MIT median is 1520 to 1580. That's out of 1600. These are near perfect scores. The NYU median is 1450, 1530, and ever since the COVID years, the median scores at all colleges have been trending upward, which means it's more competitive and even more difficult for our students to get into these colleges. So they have to even do this much more work on their SATs in order to improve those scores. And we're going to talk about why that trend is the case and why it all started with COVID as well. Many of the colleges, even though they went test optional in the COVID years, have returned to mandating the tests. You can see from the chart here, it says the Ivy League shift, over half have reinstated the SAT, and many more are likely to follow suit. Public mandates, university systems in Georgia and Florida now require the scores. MIT was one of the first schools to return to the SAT. They said we can't let students in our college who are not scoring over a 700 on the math because they simply won't be able to make it. They won't be able to succeed. MIT, Dartmouth, many of them say, well, we need this test to place students appropriately because we don't want students, foundering at our schools. I got this datum from the College Board's website itself. It says 21 private and 42 public colleges explicitly require the SAT. And then there are many who don't explicitly require it, but they sort of implicitly require it. And we'll talk about why that's the case as well. Monica?
OK，就是今天的话，本场讲座 Steve 老师想回答的主要是很多家长都会问的问题，就是 SAT 为什么重要？我们不是来劝大家一定要卷 SAT，而是想用数据和政策的变化帮家长判断一件事：在当下的升学环境当中，如果忽视 SAT 意味着什么？在讲座的前面，Steve 老师的话，他给了一些数据。那么我们可以看到，SAT 它的存在，它其实最初的目的不是为了筛选精英，而是给不同的学校、不同背景的学生可以有一个可以比较的标准。但是呢，到今天在 GPA 普遍通胀的情况下，反而这个功能就变得很重要了。像 MIT、NYU 这样子的学校，我们可以看到它真实的竞争的区间就是 medium range 中位数，基本是在1450到1550加。那放在Dr. Steve 老师之前他说的他的学生因为他教了 SAT 30多年。那很早之前的话，可能你1300，你可能1200，你甚至就可以获得一些 scholarship。但是放在现在，你这个 SAT 的成绩，你像1300这样子已经不够看了。现在的话，基本上如果要去一些比较好的学校，都是1500或者是1000，就像那个常春藤1550加。所以大家可以看到 SAT 的分数并没有贬值。反而竞争的密度变高了，而且在 pandemic 之后，也有一个非常重要的趋势，就是顶尖的学校正在系统性的恢复 SAT 和 ACT 的要求。那么在他们真实的录取当中，仍然他们是高度依赖标化成绩来判断孩子的学术准备的。OK， that's my part. You can go ahead, Dr. Lister.
So now you can see from this slide that this is a chart showing how many schools have gone test optional from 2019. And you can see as the bars are growing, that means more and more schools have said, well, it's okay, test optional. And that seems like they were doing the students a favor. Tough times during COVID. Lots of students weren't getting, the proper schooling. They weren't even getting to class. We know all the horrors many of us faced in education during the COVID years. And so the colleges seemed to be doing something that was going to benefit the students by going test optional. But an interesting thing happened. And what happened is only the colleges ended up benefiting from the test optional strategy. You can see what happens first is that once schools go test optional, many students who would not have applied in the past suddenly start applying to these schools. Why not? It's test optional. If I was not going to get a good SAT score, that would exclude me from applying to NYU. If I don't have to submit my score, well, I'll apply. So the applications surge, which means that the colleges get more applications. They collect more application fees. but they only take the same number of students that they've always taken. I mean, there are only so many seats at these universities. So what happened is the colleges became more selective because of test optional, not less selective. And then the students who were submitting the scores were only those students who were exceeding the 1350, the 1400, and the score kept climbing and climbing and climbing. These days, just about every student who wants to submit, because that student wants to be considered for an elite college, wants to get a 1500 plus. Again, that is so much higher than any student would ever have needed to achieve in the pre-COVID years. So what ends up happening is the students must work harder to get the fewer spots that are available in the colleges that are allegedly doing them a favor by going test optional. Here's some data that will show you how much certain universities have benefited from the test optional strategy. You can see from the graph that NYU's application shot up by 49%. Their admission rate dropped from 16% to 8% now, and then their median SAT score went up an incredible 90 points. So NYU benefited, but the students did not. Now, another side benefit is, as you can see over here on the right-hand side of the slide, is the prestige effect, because now NYU can say, our SAT scores are higher than ever, and we're selecting only the most elite students, and we're accepting far fewer by way of percentage than we used to, because they're getting so many more applications. They seem like they're more selective, and colleges like to look like they're selective. Boston University, their applications grew by 31%. Their admission rate went from 19 to 11, and their SAT score went up 70 points. Colgate, 110% application growth, their admission rate cut in half by a percentage, and their median SAT score up 80 points. So there's the data showing that the schools are benefiting from the alleged or the test optional strategy, but now our students have to work so much harder. Monica?
OK，就是前面 Dr. Lister 老师讲到了，就是 SAT 的话，它有 test optional 选项，就很多人以为就是 test optional 是对学生有利，但实际未必如此。疫情之后呢，确实很多学校都采取了 test optional，但是我们要清楚它意味着什么，谁真正受益。在学校变成 test optional 之后呢， SAT 的申请人数其实是更暴增的，就是学校其实收到了更多的申请费。但是呢，在这里面大家要注意，就是对学生来说，提交分数的，就是当他们觉得自己不够高的话，很多人他就不敢提交，所以导致了现在提交人数的，往往他们的分数都是1500加，那么导致了所谓的竞争的基准从比如说之前的1350或者是1400就提升到1500加。那么大家可以很明显的看到，老师在这边列了一些数据。你像 NYU， 它 SAT 的中位数的分数，在近几年的话，已经提升到了从1440到1530，提升了90分。它的录取率呢，大家可以看到，就是 admission rate 是下降了一半。那 Boston University 的话，中位数的话也提升了，就是 SAT 的成绩也提升了70分。所以现在的话，大家可以看到 SAT 就是这个高分的情况，大家考到高分的是更多了，反而竞争是更激烈。OK， please go ahead.
Similarly, in the public systems, we see a similar dynamic. So many of us know that the University of California system went to the test blind policy. So what happened then was they said, okay, well, we're not taking SAT scores, but then all of a sudden the applications surged. So you can see over there on the left-hand side, but the acceptance rates did not. So UCLA's acceptance rate remained at 9.4%, Berkeley's at 11.4%. And then the schools had to make other ways of assessing the students. So obviously things more like GPA became more important. So now there became pressure on high schools to inflate GPAs so students can seem more competitive at these colleges when they weren't going to submit SAT scores. And so then we get this similar dynamic again. The applications go up. The students are still in a more competitive field because people are entering college with GPAs sometimes in excess of 4.0. I did a 4-year tour at a high school where I worked as in a high school environment, and this was a private high school. And many of the students there had GPAs that were in excess of 4.0, which is better than perfect because there was such great inflation to sort of combat this competitiveness for these fewer spots because of the surges in the application rates. So what ends up happening? Those who can score very high on the SAT have to score as high as they possibly can to get themselves in these elite positions, fewer elite positions that are now or opportunities at the competitive schools. If your scores are lower than the typical benchmarks, most students don't want to submit unless they're in that top quartile of any college's score range. So if you're not there, then you have the lower scores, then you just get sort of put in the pool with everybody else and hope that there's some other way that you can get into that school, because many of these colleges now are saying, well, if we have somebody coming in with a 1530 on the SAT, it doesn't necessarily compute to worry about your 5.5 GPA. So the students now who are sort of in the middle pack have to strive harder and harder, and therefore, their SAT score becomes more and more important so that they can set themselves apart and actually engage in this application process and get the kinds of scores that are going to get them considered for the elite schools. Now, I've spent 25 years as a college professor, and in that time, I worked mostly with students working on writing and reading and linguistics and literature. And I can tell you that my experience is that many of the students, even at the college level, are ill-equipped to handle the reading difficulty that is now in the new SAT. The SAT has changed significantly. The digital SAT in the old days had sort of these big, fairly easy reading passages, and now it has much shorter passages. And when I first saw that change, I thought the test was going to be much simpler than it used to be, but it is not. It is not. The passages are incredibly dense. I will have some data to show you that. Actually, I have some data on this slide right here. You can see that the Flesch-Kincaid grade level for most of the SAT language is 12 to 14. 12 to 14, 12 would be senior in high school, 14 would be a sophomore in college. This is the average reading level in the SAT passages. The Lexile index is obviously comparable. The 1200 and 1400 correspond to the 12 and 14 early college. Another way of saying that, this is like the students are faced reading scholarly text, scholarly nonfiction. And then the score, the SAT is also adaptive. A lot of parents don't seem to be aware of that. It's changed. In the old days, the test was not adaptive. Since the digital changeover, if a student does particularly well on the first module of the reading and writing or of the math is also adaptive, then they get put into a much harder second module. Now, the reason for that is they will be eligible for a higher total score, but then the difficulty is increased massively. So the students who do want to score in that elite range not only have to do extremely well in the first module to guarantee placement into the second module, the harder of the two, with the higher score ceiling, but then they have to do extremely well on it. And the level of difficulty there is extremely challenging. And I will show you that. I will concretize these claims shortly by actually giving you examples of the kinds of language that our students are facing on the SAT. If you can see over on the left, the vocabulary tiers in academics, tier 2 would be academic vocabulary. And these are the two tiers that you're going to see most likely on the SAT now, the academic tier and the domain-specific academic tier. So the academic tier would be words like exigent, ameliorate, delineate. The domain-specific would be like inchoate, jurisprudence, hegemony. And again, from experience, I can tell you that very few students in most of our high schools are typically trafficking in this kind of language. And it's not just the vocabulary, as you will see shortly. Okay.
Could you please?
I'm sorry, you want to stop there?
Yeah, yes.
Sure.
Can you stop on this slide?
Yes.
Okay, so let me do a little translation.
Sure.
在前面的话，Dr. Lister 讲到了，就是 UC 系统，大家知道，就是 UC 的话，它采用的是 test blind，就在这里面的话呢，孩子可以不用提交 SAT 的成绩，但是呢，这不一定对孩子是有利的，因为当学校它缺少客观对比标准的时候，就会更依赖于 GPA，也就是大家的那个平时的这个学术成绩。那么就导致了高中他会被迫成绩膨胀。Dr. Lister 教了30多年的书，其中他当过4年多的高中老师，他见过很多学生的 GPA 已经超过了4.0，也就是你比 A 还要高，也意味着可能孩子的话，因为我们也知道加州的话。很多学生的话，他可能修 AP 可能也修了很多门。那么 AP 如果你拿到5分的话，你的加权平均分是可以比4.0要高的。那这就导致了学生的话，他在学校的压力会很大，要把这个 GPA 抬高才显得你有竞争力。那反过来，就如果你有 SAT 的成绩，你的 SAT 成绩分数很高，那么就会显得你很有 competitive 竞争力。你可以把你好的成绩送到更多的名校去。那么对于名校的录取来说，他们也会优先去看，就是你的 SAT 成绩有1500加，对吧？他再去看其他的候选人。所以呢，在这个时候 SAT 的重要性就可想而知了。那在 SAT，Dr. Lister 教了30多年之后，现在呢，我们是 Digital SAT，就是数字化考试。本身呢，我们 Dr. Lister 以为这个 SAT 取消了长文章会降低难度，但其实完全没有。新的 Digital SAT 它的阅读，它的水平是在这儿是 Grade Level 12 to 14，就是你高中高年级到大学的2年级，就是你的阅读能力需要达到这样子的一个水平。你的蓝思只要1200L 到1400L。那提到了就是在 SAT 当中，它是这样子自适应考试，你先做 Module One，做得好的话会进入更难的 Module Two。那如果想要冲高分的学生，你就必须要去进入更难的 Module Two，把这个模块打好，那么你才能拿到高分。那这个时候的话，Module Two 它其他的阅读水平是接近研究生级别的，难度不低。可以看到老师取了 Tier 2和 Tier 3的这个单词，这些都是学术性词汇。那么可以看到这个 Tier 3这个单词，这3个单词，包括我在内，反正我看起来都是很难的啊。那么对于孩子来说的话，他要在很短的时间里面去读懂这个单词，并且要答对题，在这里面，对于孩子来说，他的阅读能力和他的词汇量一定是需要有很大的就是储备。那么我们能做什么呢？Dr. Lister 接下来会跟大家分享。好，please go ahead.
Come on. So the SAT, in many ways still matters, and it matters because it's one of the only ways that colleges can say, oh, well, I can compare a student from a high school in Kentucky with a student from a high school in France. And this SAT is going to be the one marker that's going to allow us as a college to compare their relative academic merits. So it's still being used, and it's probably only going to increase in use, especially now, given that the colleges are benefiting from returning to the SAT with their now hyperselectivity. So there's a couple of things we can do. Students have to prepare for the SAT. If they're going to want to get into the elite universities or even the highly competitive universities, then they're going to have to prepare. Then they're probably want to start preparing as soon as they possibly can. We as parents are going to have to recognize that what test optional actually means and who is actually benefiting from the test optional. It isn't a kind of get out of jail free card for students who don't want to put the time or don't have the time or effort to put into the SAT. It's simply not going away. It would be nice if the third component here were to happen as well, which is the colleges being honest and transparent about what happened since the COVID years. But that's probably not going to happen. I highly doubt that NYU is suddenly going to say, well, we're going to lower our SAT standards when they don't have to. And all that they have done since the score skewing and the score raising has benefited. So that means it's on us. It's on the parents and it's on the students to do what we can to overcome the situation that we're now faced with. So a thing that I want to kind of mention here is that a lot of students think, well, so-and-so did this on the SAT and I only got this, but I'm an AP this, and why didn't I do well on that? But the thing that you want to remember is that the test does not measure intelligence. All it does is measure preparedness. And I can tell you that from experience. I've seen students go from 1,000 on an SAT to a 1,300 on their next SAT to a 1,500 on their third SAT. The student's brain didn't grow significantly in the 8 or 12 months that it took to achieve those score changes. What happened is the student prepared. The more you prepare, the better you're going to do. Monica, do you want to?
OK，Yeah，OK，SAT 的话，我们可以看到数字化 SAT 没有降低难度，由于对于高分段的学生来说，那个 Module 2第二个模块文章，它在词汇、语法和逻辑上就明显更难。那么 Dr. Lister 也讲到了，就是在目前 GPA 通货膨胀的时候，SAT 这个标化成绩它显得尤为重要。那我们该怎么样去以最大的努力去准备？老师刚才讲了一句，他说了很多年了，就是 SAT 不是测智商，而是测的是你有没有准备好 SAT， 你是否已经准备好了这个考试。如何去准备，需要孩子和家长，也就是我们自己去尽最大的努力，去把这个考试在考前做好准备。OK，那接下去该如何去准备呢？Dr. Lister 老师的话会跟大家去讲一下。那我们接下去进入我们的第二个模块，就是我们要回答一下，就是如何去读经典文学，去这样子可以系统性的去提升你孩子的 SAT 英语成绩。Hey, Dr. Lister, we can go to the second slides.
Thank you, Mona. Just give me a second. Visible? Yeah. You've already gone through this part, right?
Yeah, I already gone to this part.
Okay. So one of the things that we can do as educators, and we're hoping to do as educators, is find ways of preparing the students for the SATs that are organic and ways that will help them achieve mastery over not just the SAT itself, but the kinds of skills that actually matter so that they acquire the skills to do well on the SAT without specifically just saying, well, I need to train for the SAT. And one of the reasons that, or one of the main things that we would need to think about to achieve that would be the reading level. As I was trying to indicate before, the reading on the SAT has become incredibly difficult. Well, and as I said, we will see examples of that. In the old days, students would adopt strategies where they would read the first or last sentence of a paragraph and then go to the answer choices and quickly look back. And they were able to do that because the text was facile. It was much easier than the kinds of things that they're facing now. The current SAT, however, requires them to read carefully and deeply. And one of the things that I hear most from my students who are coming back from the digital SAT is, I ran out of time. I ran out of time because it took me so long to understand the passages because the passages are dense semantically. In other words, they have dense vocabulary and difficult, complex syntactically. They're simply not the kinds of reading that many of our students are engaging with every day in their typical high school environments. So one of the suggestions would be, well, where can we find the kind of language that students can use to prepare? And the obvious answer is in classic literature. Many students are not required to read classic literature anymore because high schools are typically gearing their curricula to things that are more entertaining for students to keep them engaged. However, that's at a price, and the price is the students are not encountering the kinds of language and the kind of difficulty, and they're not being challenged to develop the kinds of interpretive skills that are going to help them not only on something like the SAT, but in the kinds of reading and writing that they're going to be required to do in college. So training with classic literature, the reading becomes, as you can see on the slide, an act of agency. This isn't about memorization. This is about understanding. So the connection between the literature and SAT. On the SAT, the students have to do all kinds of textual analyses. They do have to analyze things that are like poems or excerpts from plays or excerpts from larger works of literature like novels. So they do have to have a literary understanding in the artistic sense, but they also have to be able to read dense scientific prose with lots of Latinate words and Latinate vocabulary. And they have to be able to read difficult social science prose. And many times they're encountering words that they have never encountered or have never seen in any particular context. But if they engage these words in the kinds of places that they naturally occur, not on like a 3x5 card or not on a Quizlet where they're just clicking a button and seeing a word and trying to memorize the definition, then they can come to own these words, not just maybe get them correct on an SAT, but maybe to be able to incorporate them into their own spoken and written vocabularies. What's more is an analysis of classic literature requires students to look very carefully at text and perform a kind of rhetorical analysis on the text. They have to be able to understand the relationship between connotations and syntax and semantics and various rhetorical tropes and sophisticated notions of point of view. I have found myself saying repeatedly when I'm working with students on the SAT, point of view is everything. And many of them throw up their hands and go, I'm not sure what you mean by that. So these are the kinds of analyses that are done routinely in a literary classroom, but they're not getting typically done in your average high school classroom. I want to talk about a couple of the, as I said earlier, the difficulty of the language on the SAT. I want to concretize that for you now. One measure that linguists use to talk about the difficulty of a written or passage or even spoken language is called lexical density. And lexical density is the number of content words per clause. It's not necessary that you really understand what that means if you don't. If you do, that's great. But if you don't, it's not that big of a deal. What does matter are the numbers. You can see on these charts that these are numbers from particular passages on the SAT. I did the lexical density analysis of these, and they ranged from 3.6, which is sort of like sophisticated spoken language, written language, all the way to 5.1, which is like sophisticated scientific language, which means these are dense passages. This is the kind of language most of our students are not accustomed to using, and this is the kind of language that they're facing. But lexical density is not the only measure of the difficulty, but it is certainly one, and it's not just the vocabulary, but it's certainly the vocabulary as well. So this is a measure of the sophistication beyond density. So what I mean by that is if you look at the two passages side by side, forgive me one second, I have to move the Zoom thing. You'll see that the first one is from a work of literature. I was just this evening working with students on this very passage. So I'm just going to read it for you. This passage says, he was deemed a coxcombical fellow, a mere jackanapes by the gentry, clearly not a personage of importance. That's just a part of the passage. This comes from Herman Melville's famous novel, The Confidence Man, written in 1857, I think. The language seems archaic to many of the students. The vocabulary is off the charts. I have yet to encounter a student who's ever seen the word coxcombical or jackanapes for that matter, never mind knows what they mean in context. And yet you can see the lexical density is only 3.8, which is really not that bad. The lexical density is not the only measure of the difficulty. You see the one over on the right, this is from a scientific passage. The lexical density is even lower, but listen to the language. Optimizing the electron transport layer via spin coding dramatically improves the conversion efficiency of the cell. That takes a lot of metabolizing in order for students to kind of understand what that means. And many of the students have not had experience reading that level of writing. And so one of the things that we could sort of bring to the table in this process of training them to prepare for this much more difficult test is getting them to engage with this language at this level of difficulty. Monica, did you want to go?
Yeah, it's my turn. Dr. Steve Lister 老师有30多年的教学经验，他曾经做过耶鲁语言学校的老师，也是在大学和高中教授写作语言的，所以他的优势是他既懂 SAT 考什么，也懂怎么用文学精读把这个 SAT 高分的能力训练出来，帮助孩子们能通过这个系统的文学训练，然后让孩子的 SAT 成绩冲到1500加。所以呢，在前面 Dr. Lister 老师在前面 slides 里面讲到，为什么精读重要，就是大家要理解 SAT 现在它不吃快速阅读这一套，它更多的是看你能不能读出句子真正的意义。那么经典文学当中的长难句、复杂表达会帮助孩子去训练他的肌肉和耐受力，让孩子在考试的压力也能稳定的去读懂作者的意图。因为我们在这边 SAT 它拼的是你是否能读懂。那在前面，Hi Dr. Lister, can you go back to the previous slides? Yeah, this one. OK, 在这个经典文学训练的3件事里面，这个文学的分析、语境中的词汇以及修辞分析，刚好就是 SAT 考试的一个核心。它需要去让孩子在阅读当中去了解，就文学分析这里面作者的主旨意图，然后推断，以及一些细节题。语境中的词汇呢，就是在经典的文学作品当中，我们遇到这些高级词，可以在语境当中去背单词，这比你单纯的背单词要记忆更深刻，你也能更好的应用。同时呢，你在阅读当中也要去理解作者的目的与意图，你要去读懂他的作者的语气，以及他如何去论证了他的一些观点。这些都是我们在 SAT 考试当中需要去考察的这个能力的。接下去 ，please click next and next。刚才前面那张 slides 就是我让老师快速过去的那张 slides，其实讲到的就是因为老师是语言学这方面的那个那个博士啊，所以他用了一个单词叫做 lexical density， 就是那个语言的密度。那么词密度就是一句话里面有多少的信息量，信息量多大这个词密度在 SAT 的考试当中，老师举了。就是这个真题里面就2个句子一个是这个 literature anecdote 是3.8，还有一个是3.6。可以看到这个词密度并不是特别高，但是呢，它并不代表就简单了。有些文章虽然信息量不大，但是大家可以看到它里面的用词是很古典的，语气里面也有反讽，它的层次很丰富。所以在读这样子的句子的时候，仍然能感受到它这个句子并不简单，还是挺复杂的所以 SAT 的难在它要读懂这个层次，而不仅仅只是说你认不认识这个单词。That's my part.
So one of the things that is a difficult thing that we'd like to overcome in training students with classic literature is the temptation for students to think that they could sort of game the SAT just by memorizing vocabulary lists. In the past, maybe that would have been one way to succeed at achieving a decent score on the specifically vocabulary questions, but that doesn't even help us these days. There are very few lists that are comprehensive and that cover the kinds of words that are likely to occur. And also the new SAT has not been around that long. I will show you later that I have used some data that have been available to compare the kinds of language that occurs on the new SAT with the kind of language that students will encounter or reading classic literature. Another issue with the classic literature is that it's not just about the words, it's about the culture, it's about historical events. And these are the kinds of things that sometimes students are not accustomed to facing because they have not had any experience with them. They don't know anything about the Jazz Age or Art Deco because they haven't read Gatsby. And then we get a passage like that, it's completely alien to them. The passage before from 1857 is completely alien to many of our students because they're not going to hear that language, on YouTube or Netflix. They're only going to find that language in classic literature. Well, many of them aren't reading it. So what happens is they encounter these passages and then they panic. And what ends up happening is they have to reread and reread and reread. And then they spend too much time on a particular question. And then they don't have enough time to finish the test. And that, again, I can tell you from experience, is the number one issue for most of the students that I've been working with ever since the change to the digital SAT. So one of the things that we can do is we could take all of the skills that are required, and again, not just for doing well in the SAT writing section, but the kinds of skills that are going to be transferable to the things that students will be doing in college. They will be doing analyses of writing, most of the ways they're going to be learning is through text. They're going to have to read. Even if they're looking at charts and videos and PowerPoints, they're still engaging through text. They're still demonstrating their mastery through text. That's never going to go away. And where are they going to find the best models for this is, of course, in the kinds of classic literature that demonstrates the very skills that they will be using in college. So they can do all of these things simultaneously. They could become better and faster readers. They can work at all kinds of texts and engage and develop cultural literacy. They can build their vocabulary. They can build syntactic, or we may as well think of that as grammatical awareness. And then they could also be held accountable for their rhetorical analyses in that they would be responding both verbally in a classroom situation or with written responses to prompts, asking them to engage in rhetorical analyses of the texts that they have been reading. Monica?
Thank you. Now it's my turn. 很多家长呢以为 SAT 难在词汇，其实更难的是刚才我们讲到的这个词密度，就是信息密度加语气加结构。就比如说同样的一篇文章，前面的话 Lister 老师呢给了例子，他的难点可能来自于学生对于历史背景陌生，科技术语这个词比较。科技术语的密集或者是文学语气和象征比较陌生，所以导致孩子没有办法抓到这个结构，抓到逻辑的重点，识别它的语气。那么很多孩子会出现的问题就是，可能单词背了，但是一换文章就认不出来；技巧学了，但是考试呢就用不上来。一看到历史类的文章，可能就慌。这些其实都不是说智力的问题，而是训练方式的问题。所以 Lister 老师给的解决方案，我们用经典的文学作为载体，把 SAT 所需要的能力一次性的训练打磨出来。词汇、语法和分析能力不是分开学，而是在真实的语境当中进行同步的提升。That's all from me. You can click the next.
You're going to hear me use the phrase close reading a lot from this point forward, and I'm going to spend some time unpacking that term, so it's going to make a little more sense. And I'm going to do that for a reason, because it might sound like, well, students are always reading classic literature in middle school and high school. I will tell you from experience that that is not always the case. But even if they are, many of the curricula now are designed on what's called the expressivist paradigm, which means students are asked to say how they feel about something, which is, perhaps fine in certain contexts, but it doesn't require them to engage with the language in any way. It just requires them to have an emotional reaction to it and then record that reaction, which is not what close reading is supposed to mean. Close reading is supposed to allow them to make inferences about text, allow them to read in a way that they can use syntactic and semantic clues to figure out what somebody's point of view is on a particular topic and how they're supposed to be reading that topic. So in general, close reading is going to involve an active strategy and one that would involve an annotation of the text, not simply a reading of the text and reacting emotionally to it. The idea of how to annotate a text using close reading strategies will be developed in further slides as well. One of the main things students have to do on the SAT is infer, in other words, not just merely match language to language or sort of fill in a blank. They, in many ways, are kind of disallowed from responding with some sort of emotional, idiosyncratic, personal interpretation because the College Board cannot reward them for that because everybody would have a different, by definition, idiosyncratic or emotional interpretation. So they have to make inferences based on the logic of the text, what would follow most logically. But if they don't understand the logic of the text because it's beyond them, then they're never going to be able to make the kinds of inferences that are expected of them. But these are exactly the kinds of things that we would have to do with classic literature because we're not getting a summary. We're not getting pure information. We're getting words from which we are going to determine or develop a sense of somebody else's consciousness, somebody else's point of view on a particular scene, on a particular character. And another way to do that would be to look very carefully at the ways sentences are constructed. These are not arbitrary, and students on the SAT have to make the kinds of decisions that they would make while they were reading classic literature because the syntax matters. Great writers are artists. They have crafted their sentences so that the sentence says exactly what they intended to mean, and they're saying it in such a way that the tone is going to be available to those students who could decode those complexities in the syntax. And lastly, close reading strategies require students to connect ideas to broader themes, to bigger ideas. And this is exactly the sort of thing that translates into I can now read a passage and come up with an inference that is logically available based on the passage. Monica?
Thank you. Yeah. 我们讲到的就是这个精读，它不是说你慢慢的读，而是要有方法的去读。那么 Dr. Lister 老师呢，举了就是精读的4个步骤，这也是非常关键的。我们这4步几乎涵盖了所有 SAT 阅读和写作的全部核心题型。好，第一个标注。标注呢，因为时间的原因啊，我就只是能简短的说一下老师的刚才讲的一些关键的信息。标注是圈出这个关键的信息词，它的转折，还有态度的变化。那么推断就是读出这个字面背后的意思，然后分析去拆句法，看语气的变化，连接是把细节、主旨、作者的目的连接起来，这样子的去有效的去阅读。Okay, you can go to the next.
So the larger curriculum for a kind of marriage between classic literature and the SAT would involve all of these skills, which are, and forgive me 1 second to move this, close reading, and then turning that close reading into a kind of argument. In other words, not just being able to read the text, but being able to turn that text into a kind of argument through writing. So students will not only read, but they will have their reading ability evaluated through their ability to write about what they've read. And then obviously throughout the entire process, they will be engaging in literary analysis of language, analysis of syntax, analysis of vocabulary, analysis of theme and setting, and all of the other components that we would find in literature, all of which, again, are built on language. Some analytical foci. Identify an author's primary purpose. These are the kinds of things that students are asked to do on the SAT, and these are exactly the kinds of things students are asked to do in a good literature classroom. Track the structure of an argument. Very few students seem to have experience with this. There's a specific style of question on the SAT that exactly asks that question what is this argument structure? Many students find that sort of language alien. Well, what do you mean? What's the structure? Because they're looking at the gist of it. They're thinking, well, I see sort of the ideas that were going on here, but I'm not noticing that there's an architecture to those ideas. They're going to, in a literature classroom, decode figurative language, the kinds of language that is only going to occur typically in good writing and good literature. On the SAT, in the reading comprehension section, very often students have to read an entire poem. That is the passage. It's a poem, or it's a excerpt from a novel or a play, and the language in there again could be highly metaphorical. They could have to engage in things with like metonymy, which many of them have not had a lot of experience with. And even if it's not a typical literary trope, the subtleties of the language are so important that these days I find myself saying to students, every word matters, every single word. You have to be so careful to understand every single word. And then lastly, there was an entire SAT section called the evaluation or command of evidence, they call it, which is, again, the sort of requirement that falls aside in the typical high school expressivist paradigm where students are just reacting emotionally, saying, well, this is how I feel about it. But if I'm telling you I feel a certain way, I don't have to necessarily substantiate or support those claims. But if I make a judgment about a character, or if I make a judgment about a symbol in a piece of literature, well, then I would have to use actual evidence, and I would have to be able to evaluate that evidence and show the connection between the evidence and the claims that I have been making. Monica?
OK，从 close reading 精读这个词开始，它在教育界当中很常见，但往往只是口号，就是它没有被真正的具体化。那么在 Dr. Lister 讲到了，就是传统的精读，我们需要去做标注，对吧？学生常常边读边做一些批注。那么阅读被动的去进行输入，但是呢，在 SAT 的阅读过程当中，尤其现在是 digital 考了，所以我们呢没有办法像做那个纸质的考试一样，你去做批注，但是还是需要有一些就是方法去训练，怎么去抓住这些 SAT 当中要考的重点。第一个就是我们需要找出作者的主旨，追踪它这个论证结构，然后解码修辞语言，比如说是比喻啊，或者是反讽，然后是评估这个证据。在 SAT 的考试当中，它要求学生不仅要去理解它表层的意义，还要学会推断、分析、连接观点，这些都是考试需要考的能力。那么老师也一直强调，就是最好精读呢，能跟分析性的这个写作能结合在一起，就是思考它有些时候发生在写作技术和文本之间。当你更会写的时候，你就会更会思考，你可以去把你的思考内化。Okay, please go ahead.
As I promised, I want to talk a little more detail about what we actually mean by close reading so that it doesn't just sound like some educational buzzword that doesn't really have any content. So I'm going to try and map that for you at two different levels. And the first is to do what I'm going to call a mapping of the geometry of syntax. In other words, that the ways that we engage with text are mediated through the ways that the writers encode the words on the page. Writers have choices, and the choices they make are going to determine how we react to the text and what we understand from the text. So one of the things I like to teach students to start looking at is use the actual parts of the syntax, like clauses and phrases, and the signals that are being sent to you, like the punctuation, to derive meaning. So this is a very simple example, but it will, excuse me, illustrate the point. You see that this is a sentence from the passage that we read earlier, which is, again, by the way, an actual SAT passage. Though the savant scoffed at the jackanapes, he was unprepared for the man's good sense. Many students don't have names for what's going on in this, and they don't have a way of saying, okay, I can look at that first chunk of language, though the savants cost of the jackanapes, and say, well, there's a clause in there, but it's been backgrounded. It's been backgrounded because it's a dependent clause. It's been subordinated by that word though that creates the subordinate construction. If it's a subordinate construction, then it's not the main idea. The main idea I should be looking at would be in the independent clause. You'll notice also that the background came first because Melville's a good writer, so he makes his concession, and then he provides us with the main clause, which is signaled by the comma. I can tell you from experience, again, that probably 80 or 90% of the students that I work with don't have a sense that the comma is anything meaningful in the text. They're taught things like it's about breathing, it's about pausing, or you just use them when you feel like it. So they're not using them as signals to say, oh, that comma just told me what the subject of this sentence is. That comma told me the subject was this he that had been referred to earlier. So it's he that is the subject of the sentence, was unprepared for the man's good sense. You will also notice that after that pivot, the sentence ends on the unpreparedness for the man's good sense. That's often called end focus. The end focus is the sentence's most important idea. It's built on something that we already know, and it's given us something new. These are levels of analyses that students are going to be able to engage in if they have experience with this kind of language and they have someone who can walk them through this kind of approach. Monica?
OK，老师讲了一个就是概念，就是 geometry of syntax， 句法的几何结构。那么在 SAT 的考试当中，语法和标点它，尤其是在这里面，老师提到了这样子一个句子啊，中间有个逗号，它不是简单的停顿，它其实是一个结构信号。就是逗号和从句，它就是在告诉你哪一部分是背景，哪一部分是重点。在 SAT 的 Standard English Conversation 里面，它是很吃结构意识的，就是我们把这个句子可以当成一个建筑图纸来拆，我们把它拆解开，孩子呢才不会被这个长难句带跑。所以在这里，逗号它可以去标示主语结构。那么孩子就理解了这些就是句子的结构和这个标点的规则，理解清楚了，才能够快速的抓到句子的主干和重点，而这也是 SAT 它要考你的考点。That's all from me. Please go ahead.
Another way I'd like to concretize this idea of close reading is going to refer specifically to a science style passage, although it's a strategy that could be used in any kind of passage for the SAT. So obviously, there are reasons why I can't reproduce entire SAT passages for you in a slideshow because, that's copyright infringement. So what I did is I mocked up a graph that's on one of the SAT's tests. And this SAT would be considered a science passage, and that graph is a pretty good approximation of the one that students see on the SAT. But the one on the SAT, I will tell you, is much more intimidating. It has a couple of axes there, and it's about the death of coral because of a lack of oxygen, because of an increased magnesium and calcium ratios found in the water. First of all, that's a lot to metabolize already. And then secondly, there are these causal relationships. As the ratio of the magnesium and the calcium goes up, the oxygenation goes down, the coral's death goes up, but it doesn't go up in both places. As you can see from the chart, one graph is much higher than the other. So the students have to map all of these relationships, and many of them do not have a strategy for doing that. So at a level below, you might say, the level of syntax, or behind the level of syntax would be a sort of level of logic. So not just understanding what the syntax and punctuation and semantics, the vocabulary, mean at the surface level, but saying what are the relationships of the players in any given passage. So what I encourage students to do so that they can read a passage, have a strategy for decoding the information so that they only have to read the passage once, is to actively engage in what I call the schematization of the data. I'll develop this a little more in subsequent slides after Monica shares this with you, but you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, the proxy chain. As the ratio of the magnesium and calcium goes up, that little arrow suggests a valence change. It went up. The arrow to the right says, well, that's a causal relationship. Well, what did it cause? It caused oxygenation to go down. What happens when oxygenation goes down? Well, that causes the choral decline. So what I often have students train to do is map these things in a kind of algebra of the language. They use abbreviations. They use the valence arrows and the causal arrows. And especially for the difficult science passages that overcomes the hurdle of thinking, I need to understand every single little piece of vocabulary, when really what I need to understand are the logical relationships that underpin all of that vocabulary.
OK，SAT 的阅读当中呢，也会考，就是英语当中也会考图表，还有就是因果逻辑题。那么老师举了这个例子啊，就是珊瑚的寿命与锰钙比例的关系。这儿不是在考数学啊，它其实考察的就是你的阅读能力。核心它是需要你能把它的变量关系在文章当中读出来，去建立它的因果链。比如说 A 变化造成了 B 的变化，然后推导出了这样子的结论，需要用到箭头去画出这个因果关系。比如说上下箭头标注正负变化。那么学生在做这样子的题目的时候，他需要在语法的层面去理解重点，同时也要在逻辑的层面去理解变量关系。这样子的话，他才能够把这个题目当中它的考点给它做对。也就是我们在这个过程当中训练孩子用逻辑图快速的去读懂这个数据题。OK, please go ahead.
So this is just a more of an illustration of that schematizing the meaning. So if we put it all together now, we have ways of relating the logic and the claims with the causal arrows to something caused something else, to something caused by something else. The valence arrows, now these could be shifts in polarity, they could be shifts in tone, they could be shifts in anything. These are basically the up, down, good, bad, more or less kinds of shifts. Oops, sorry, I just have to move this. And then another thing to think about would be using the etymologies of words so that students can understand them in ways that they might have understood them before. I'm going to talk to you very shortly about a strategy that I'm trying to use to help students develop their vocabularies quickly in response to engaging with words in actual literature and the words that they encounter on the SAT, through a kind of exploration of the word's roots and the common roots that are likely to occur in English, from its traces through French and Latin, and then transferred to a great number of vocabulary. Just for fun, I took the word valence here. Valence is a word that I've been using in this conversation. It's a word that comes from Latin, and it's associated with strength. And then we see it in other words. So if I know that VAL in Latin means strength, and I see it in a word like value or valor, and an SAT or anywhere else for that matter, that I might have a way of recovering that word, or at least putting it in its larger semantic family. Monica?
OK，老师介绍了3个工具啊，就是在做题当中可以用到的，就因果箭头、语气变化和词根词组。那么因果箭头呢，就是我们刚才前面讲到的那个珊瑚寿命的那道看似是数学题的，就是在阅读文章这种就是科技文当中，需要有逻辑把它这个变化，它这个逻辑用图表可以给它画出来，这样就避免孩子反复的去读，因为你 SAT 的考试时间是非常紧的。那么第二个就是 valence， 它的语气即兴，也就是你要在这个文章当中去看到作者态度是如何变化的，比如从怀疑到赞赏，那么态度的一个变化。还有就是root depth， 就是词根词组，用这个来去理解单词，而不是单纯的靠死记硬背。那老师就举到了这个 valence， 他们因为我们的这个英语它其实是有自己的词根的。那在这里面有了这些3个工具，孩子就能从猜题变成能读懂题。老师接下去呢也会举一下具体的例子，然后深度的讲解一下这个词根和词组。OK, please go ahead.
These are some samples that I took from The Great Gatsby. So these are words that occurred in Gatsby. These are the sentences in which they occurred. And this is how it might look on the SAT. I'm going to only use one here for an illustration. If you take a look at the first one, the SAT word is supercilious. That word occurs in The Great Gatsby. And here is the sentence. Now, he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. On the SAT, students might see a little line like that, and then they're asked to say, okay, well, what does supercilious mean? And from here, they would have to kind of gather as much as they could in order to know that word. So getting back to that idea of looking at words carefully and discovering sort of their hidden histories from their etymologies, where they came from, students can be taught that a word like supercilious, we know super means above, and cilia is something they've encountered probably in biology class, which means hair. And then they can be taught that supercilious means raising your eyebrow. Who's the kind of person that would raise their eyebrow at other people? Well, that's an arrogant person. And that's where that word comes from. So it's not so much that every single time we look at the etymology of the word, we're going to find something as interesting or fun as that. But in a case like that, when you do have that marriage of the roots and some way of recovering that word, I don't know of any student I've ever talked to about a word like that who's forgotten it after they realize it just means raising your eyebrow, and then they associate it with arrogance. Oh, I'm sorry, Monica, did you want to go?
Yes, I will do a quick translation.
Okay.
老师就是把 SAT 的高频词放在这个了不起的盖茨比当中啊，举例子，比如说这个 supercilious，我们把这个词拆开，就是 super 是上方，然后 cilious 在生物当中好像是跟毛发有关，那么你可以把联想成是 eyebrow 眉毛，那在眉毛的上方，相当于就是挑眉，我们可以联想到的是傲慢。如此这样子去记忆的话，学生就很难再忘记了。这也就是我们在真实的语境当中，用经典作家的句子去理解这个词汇，那么你就可以就是做到对这个词汇的深刻理解。一旦如果你知道了词根和词组，即便没有背过这个单词，考试的时候呢，也能去推断它的词义。Okay, you can go to the next.
So I want to quickly talk about some of the student takeaways before we move on. And obviously, we're talking about empowering our students here. And one of the ways they can do that is through this reading of classic literature, because they can develop the sort of fluency with difficult language that's going to put them in a position to understand what they're reading and hopefully practice the kind of skills that will allow them to understand what they're reading at a first pass, at least in a testing situation. In a classroom situation, they might have an opportunity to reread a text more than once, but in a testing situation, they're certainly not. And the better they're going to get at this reading carefully, reading for the logic, reading for the syntax, reading for the punctuation clues. This is the kind of stuff that's going to make them read that much more fluently in any situation, whether it be an actual standardized test or in their future college classrooms. So the idea here would be, if they're comfortable with this, it's sort of like a physical training analogy. The more they train with these kinds of difficult texts, the easier it's going to seem when they're faced with challenging texts in the future. So the connection is very simply here. The classics, they are both, they are a combination of cultural literacy and SAT prep. Two advantages that carry way beyond simply advancing a score on the SAT, but achieving that as well. Monica?
OK，精读就是让孩子有把握的、稳定的去理解，而不是靠这个蒙。那么我们尽量的把孩子这个能力呢，就是通过阅读经典名著的能力迁移到 SAT 当中，让孩子在考试当中更有自信。OK，please next.
So the plan here is what I like to call literature for life. So the idea would be that students start reading classic literature as early as their early grade school years. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the G45, G23. These are grade levels, and these are sort of classics for students at any given grade level. Charlotte's Web, many of us probably remember from our youth. And then on the left-hand side is obviously for the older students. When you get into the high school or middle school years, modern day classics like Hatchet, and of course, all-time classics like Catcher in the Rye and To Kill a Mockingbird. So as the grade level goes up, the students are encountering more and more difficult reading that's obviously attuned to their grade level and is appropriate for their developmental skills. One of the ways to ensure that that happens is that students can be tested or at least given an opportunity to demonstrate what reading level they're at, because it's not necessarily the case that grade matches with reading level. It is unfortunately the case, the statistics for most of the high school students in the United States say something that 54% of our high school students are reading at a 5th and 6th grade level. That's kind of harrowing and kind of shocking. So when we suggest that these books are at particular grade levels, what that means is much more likely to associate with somebody's level of conversance with literature, whether it be classic literature or any other kind. So students can be given a writing sample or a reading sample, and then from that, we can determine the best place for them to fit into the kind of longer curriculum. Monica, did you want to just?
OK，我们的这个课程设计呢是循序渐进的，让孩子从比较简单的就是经典的文学名著，比如《夏洛特的网》，然后再过渡到比较难的，要了不起的盖茨比或者远大前程。那我们的分班的话呢，方式是采用基于孩子的能力，我们先会做一个诊断，用 STAR 测评，去看一下孩子的阅读能力，然后同时也会要求孩子写一下他的写作样本。那我们来根据孩子的一个阅读能力和他的写作样本，把孩子放到适合的难度区间。那在教育学当中呢，我们会把这个叫做 ZPD，就是最近发展区，就是在阅读的过程当中，既要有一些挑战，但又不至于让孩子觉得太难，感到挫败。接下去的话，我们的话也会着重的去培养孩子的阅读和耐受，也是我们之前讲到的，就是你在阅读当中需要训练的哪几方面能力。Okay, please next.
These are some of the books that were in that list that you saw earlier, and some of them are additions to it. Many of these books are on College Board's recommended reading list, and they obviously happen to dovetail with what you would think of as a classic literature curriculum. So all I've done is associate them with the kinds of things that they might be most suitable for. But obviously, even though Gatsby might be most suitable for a rhetorical analysis and tone, certainly, just think of all the cultural literacy somebody can get from Gatsby, learning about the America in the jazz era. Of Mice and Men, Vocabulary and Context, George Orwell's famous 1984, Argument, Structure, Fahrenheit 451, Main Idea, Evidence. These are the kinds of things that College Boards suggest these books might be most useful or notable for. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, The Science and the Complexity of Her Syntax, Golding's Lord of the Flies, Cause, Effect, Structure. To Kill a Mockingbird, Inference, Theme, Catcher in the Rye, Point of View, obviously, and one of the most difficult things for students to sort of overcome difficulties with point of view. Their Eyes Were Watching God, Symbolism, and again, this is another thing students are asked to do on the SAT, engage with symbols. Cisneros is The House on Mango Street, Burt's Concision and Evidence. So the idea here is there's many connections between the reading of classic literature and the development of the kind of skills that the students are going to be needing for the SAT. And they'd be doing it in a way that wasn't sort of the dry test prep mode where I'm just going to learn how to maybe approach a certain question in a test prep fashion, but they're going to develop the skills doing something that's much more meaningful and much more rich. And they're going to develop the stamina for them to face the kinds of challenges that they're going to face on the SAT, where they only have, a number of minutes to go through a passage. But if it's, something that they've had a lot of experience with, then these passages are going to seem like everyday reading for them. Also, they're going to encounter the kinds of sentences and vocabulary in the kinds of places great writers use them. It's not going to be some artificial sentence that some preparation book is going to be using to train them. It's going to be the real thing. This is where these words live and breathe, and they'll be encountering them in their natural habitats.
OK，就是在前面的话呢，我们举了很多的书单，这些都是 College Board 上面的推荐书单。 那会非常鼓励孩子们可以去阅读，因为在 TikTok 或者 YouTube 上面，你是很难去遇到，就是在SAT 词表当中那些经典的词汇，反而这些它在经典名著当中你会得到一个锻炼。那所以就是鼓励大家多阅读啊。那在阅读的当中呢，去培养自己的阅读的耐受力啊，在真实的语境当中去理解这个单词，可以真正的帮助到孩子提升他的这个词汇量。OK, please next.
Um, so the data on this slide are, I took a list that claims to be the top 550 words on the new digital SAT ever since the changeover, based on all the practice tests, based on College Board's question bank, and based on the actual tests that have occurred. So I took the 550 word list and I asked AI to find all of these words in some of the books that you just saw in those previous slides. So it went through Orwell's 1984 and told me approximately 150 words on the 550 word list are right in Orwell's book. 140 are in Shelley's book, Frankenstein, and about 90 in Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, about 80 of In Mice of Men, and about 70 in Gatsby. And Gatsby's, this is a fairly slim volume. So these are where these words live. And those aren't just the word, the 550 words is just the 550 most common words, not all of the other words that students are likely to encounter. But you can see the massive overlap between the words that they're going to face on the SAT and the vocabulary of these classic pieces of literature. Another thing that I want to feature here is that a literature program isn't just about reading, it's about reading and writing. And one of the things that I've always maintained as a writing teacher for many years at the college level is that you can't really know what you know until you can write it. And it's only in the demonstration and the representation that you can demonstrate your knowledge of anything. So students, in order to develop these skills, would integrate writing into it as well. So they would engage the feedback loop between the texts that they're reading, their thoughts about these texts, and their ways of articulating their thoughts about these texts to reinforce their comprehension. Reading improves writing, writing improves reading, writing and reading improve thinking. Sample writing assignments. I was actually just working on a Gatsby syllabus today. So these are the kinds of things that could directly translate to the kinds of things students have to do in other environments, particularly in standardized tests. Gatsby smile is described as profoundly reassuring. Writing an essay analyzing Fitzgerald's diction conveys tone. Without this kind of training, I've encountered many students who don't know how to talk about things like diction, or don't know how to recover tone from a passage. They, in an assignment like this, they have to look very specifically at the words, which is, the idea that I talked about earlier. I keep telling them every single word in these very dense passages matters. They have to demonstrate their knowledge through writing of how words shape character. And these are the skills that directly correlate with those from the SAT. Students get feedback, obviously. One of these things that you get in a classroom is feedback. So this could be a feedback protocol, just as a very quick example. Are students using language evocatively? Are they demonstrating clear logical arguments? Are they substantiating or supporting or triangulating their claims? Many students that I've encountered over the years in writing courses and literature courses fall back on, if I said something, here's a quote, and that quote shows what I just said, without doing the analytical hard work to show the actual connections between their interpretations and the claims that they're making. Also, their feedback would include grammatical analysis. In other words, does your writing follow the standard conventions of academic English? And it just so happens that on the SAT now, there is an entire section on the standard conventions of academic English. So the growth trajectory here is to go from students memorizing isolated skills and guessing and trying to game the test to feeling completely confident with their comprehension. They know what they're doing. They've integrated literature into their lives. They have the literacy skills now, and they can do confident, sophisticated analyses of sophisticated texts. A thought that I'd like to leave you with, because I don't want this to all sound like it's very instrumental and it's only about, achieving a high score in the SAT. Reading is life-changing. I think most of us who are readers know that. So this says reading is constructing another's consciousness while expanding your own. And this is that idea that I can enter into somebody's brain in some way. I can enter into another world. I can enter into Orwell's 1984, simply by having the skills to engage the words, the text. Monica, did you want to talk about the programs?
Yes, the rest of things that I can handle.
Thank you.
老师就一直，刚才老师那边留了一句话，就是他一直认为死记硬背是理解的敌人，理解了就能重建，而不是靠就是孤立的背诵。那我们的目标其实就是让学生拥有整合式就是读写的素养，做题不再靠猜，而是有把握的去分析去作答。我们的这个圣诞的精读营呢，我们采用的是8次课，每次课2小时，里面是有阅读的和写作的，就是输出和输入双重的结合。你要有文本的输入，也要有写作的输出，这样子才可以更好的去提升孩子的这个文学素养。那么在此还进入 Q&A 环节之前，就是我请那个王老师说一下一个华府 AI 俱乐部的介绍。非常感谢华府 AI 俱乐部，就是帮我们主持这一次的讲座。王老师。
大家好我们今天呢这个讲座呢是我们华府 AI 俱乐部和北美爱儒教育一起举办的活动。那我现在来介绍一下我们华府 AI 俱乐部。我们华府 AI 俱乐部的话呢，是今年10月才刚刚注册的美国501c3的那个非营利组织。我们最近呢搞了很多，就是虽然我们注册的时间很短，但是我们最近已经组织了一个初中组和一个高中组，准备参加1月20号白宫的 AI 竞赛。然后我们还将在1月10号，我们将在普特麦克图书馆举办一个适合初中生的机器人的那个就是硬件方面的和软件结合的一些课程。非常欢迎大家，如果说孩子有兴趣的话，可以到普特麦克图书馆。我们接下来会在每个星期六的上午10点，在那里，这个课程是免费的。谢谢大家。王老师。
OK，由于时间的关系的话，我可能就是家长们如果有什么问题，可以留在 chat 当中吗？稍后我可以给大家答疑，或者就是大家添加一下我的微信，有什么问题可以来联系我。那我们今天本次讲座就到这儿，如果大家还有什么问题的话，欢迎加我微信与我联系。如果想了解我们的冬季的集训营，比如说精读写作课、SAT 课程，更多的细节，那我可以再留10分钟，好吧？非常感谢，Thank you very much for Dr. Steve Lister. Thank you. Today our lecture is ended. And if they have more questions, I can handle. So thank you so much. Have a good night. Bye, Dr. Lister.
没关系。那我现在还有一点时间，如果大家有问题的话，可以打在那个chat 上面哈。那我再说一下，我们现在这个就是华府 AI 的俱乐部，我们最近就是会搞很多的一些相关的活动，就是专门跟 AI 有关，或者一些数学物理反正只要是跟科技有关的，我们都会就是接下来会慢慢会安排时间来做一些活动，看看现在有没有那个问题。另外的话，今天的这个讲座，如果大家觉得就是还有不懂的都可以就是在之后来看华府 AI 俱乐部的 YouTube 频道，我们今天的直播会在那边 YouTube 频道上面都还会有回放。
我回答一下家长的问题啊。圣诞的话呢，我们是密集上课，从12月的26一直上到1月3或者是1月4号。那这个的话是读一本书啊。小学我们是夏洛特的网，初中呢是小学高年里4、5年级我们是细数繁星，初中的话是杀死一只鸟，然后高中或者是8年级的孩子啊，如果你的阅读能力强，那么是远大前程以及了不起的盖茨比。了不起的盖茨比呢是我们的 Dr. Lister 老师，就耶鲁讲师，他来上。SAT 的话，我们也有圣诞集训。但是圣诞过后1月份，我们有一个春季的精读写作营，是1学期16次课，读2本经典名著。SAT 的话呢，是我们为了迎接3月，我记得是3月14号吧，有一场 SAT 考试，我们为3月份 SAT 考试准备了一个冲刺班。所以如果有感兴趣的3月份要考的，可以欢迎就是参加一下我们的 SAT 冲刺。杀死一只鸟，OK，有家长感兴趣加我一下微信。我们呢有早班和晚班，因为应家长的需求啊，就是还蛮多家长在咨询的，所以呢早班的话应该是美东的早上8点到10点，晚上的话好像是6点。具体时间的话，我待会儿会去看一下表啊，请家长加一下我的微信。还有问题吗？我们春季的话呢是1周1次课，1次2小时啊。但是圣诞的话，我们是密集上课，基本上是每天上啊8次课。好，王老师，
OK，如果没有什么其他问题的话，我们今天的讲座就到这儿需要看回放的话，大家回头到我们俱乐部的那个AI 华府 AI 俱乐部 Capital AI Club YouTube 频道上看回放。OK，谢谢大家。
非常感谢各位家长。